In the early 1990s, the world watched with bated breath as dramatic events unfolded in the Middle East. Iraq, fueled by the ambitious plans of its leader, Saddam Hussein, dreamed of crushing the mighty American fleet. Yet, in reality, Iraq was destined to become the victim. When Iraqi forces suddenly invaded Kuwait, brazenly challenging the entire Western coalition, official propaganda in Baghdad declared with unmasked bravado, if the Americans dare to send their ships into the Persian Gulf, a true naval battle, fought on equal terms, awaits them. The Iraqi side insisted that even the largest U.S. ships would be powerless against their coastal missiles, swift patrol boats, and a decade of war experience with Iran. The people of Iraq genuinely believed in the inevitability of the coming confrontation, and soldiers enthusiastically prepared to face what they considered outdated American battleships. However, the United States was preparing to unleash not just ships, but true maritime titans. World War II veterans, the legendary battleships USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin, were brought out of mothballs. These giants were equipped with the latest Tomahawk cruise missiles, modern guidance systems, and drones for fire correction. Their mere presence in the Gulf exerted immense psychological pressure on the enemy. For the Americans, it was a display of power. For Iraq, a serious test of strength. Tension mounted daily. The silhouettes of American ships emerged on the horizon, gathering near the coast, while in Iraqi barracks, officers meticulously developed defense plans. Saddam Hussein continued to threaten the world, promising to turn the Persian Gulf into a graveyard for foreign fleets. But in reality, this was where a story began. One side fantasized about an even fight, while the other was about to demonstrate a power that no shoreline could withstand. It's during this period that our story begins. How Iraq anticipated a naval battle with the Americans, and what happened when ships with firepower capable of leveling an entire city entered the Gulf. How did Iraq's plans collide with harsh reality? In the early morning of August 2nd, 1990, the quiet of small, oil-rich Kuwait was shattered by the roar of tank tracks and the thunder of artillery. Iraqi armored divisions swiftly crossed the border, followed by columns of soldiers pouring into the city. Within hours, Kuwait was completely occupied, and its leadership fled into exile. The world was stunned, as just the day before, Saddam Hussein had assured his neighbors there would be no invasion. Western nations reacted swiftly. Within days, the United Nations Security Council passed resolutions imposing strict sanctions and a trade embargo, and the Americans began deploying troops to Saudi Arabia. This operation, dubbed Desert Shield, brought not only soldiers but also ships to the region. Aircraft carrier groups, cruisers, and destroyers entered the Persian Gulf, ready to engage in combat at any moment. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein, intoxicated by an easy victory, continued to defy. His generals assured him that the U.S. fleet would be helpless against dozens of coastal batteries, hundreds of mines, and hidden fast-attack craft, ready to strike at any moment. Baghdad television broadcast videos purportedly showing Iraqi missiles destroying American ships. The public was convinced, if it came to a fight, Iraq would emerge victorious. But the Allies were forming their own plans. They deliberately escalated the tension, showcasing the presence of more and more ships in the Gulf. By late autumn, an entire armada, capable of striking hundreds of targets simultaneously, was lined up along the coast. Iraq found itself encircled and gradually lost the initiative. However, in Baghdad, they didn't understand this, continuing to believe that an equal battle awaited them. January 1991 was approaching, when the coalition's patience would run out and Desert Shield would transform into Desert Storm. It was then that the world would witness how the Iraqi command's expectations would clash with a brutal reality. By the end of 1990, the Persian Gulf resembled a vast military base more than a maritime expanse. On the horizon, one after another, the silhouettes of aircraft carriers appeared, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. New vessels arrived daily. Iraqi observers recorded their presence but dared not report the truth higher up. It was too dangerous to inform Saddam that the coalition forces already vastly outnumbered Iraq. The arrival of two Titans, the battleships USS Wisconsin and USS Missouri, made a particular impression. For the Iraqi military, it was a genuine shock. In Baghdad, they were portrayed as old and obsolete ships, but in reality, these giants had undergone extensive modernization. They now carried not only colossal 16-inch guns capable of pulverizing concrete bunkers, but also dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles that could strike targets hundreds of miles away. The presence of such ships was a symbol in itself. It was a challenge, a message to Iraq and the world. America was ready to employ even its most archaic weapons of war, armed with the latest technology. For the Allies, this became a potent psychological weapon. A Saudi general, observing the American battleships' firing exercises, later admitted, "I would give anything to have a ship like that in our Navy." While the Americans methodically strengthened their positions, Saddam continued to believe in the strength of his defenses. His generals reported thousands of mines, powerful coastal missile launchers, and surprises awaiting the Americans at sea. Iraqi newspapers published articles claiming that the U.S. fleet wouldn't even dare approach the Kuwaiti coast. But the more time passed, the more obvious it became. This was exactly what the Americans were aiming for. They were leading Iraq to the moment when the myth of an equal battle would finally crumble. And so, January 1991 arrived. Hundreds of coalition ships lined up in battle formation. Their decks were filled with aircraft, and below decks, thousands of missiles awaited orders. The situation reached its breaking point. The world held its breath. Only days remained until Desert Shield would transform into Desert Storm. As American aircraft carriers and battleships gathered in the Gulf, Baghdad confidently declared, "If the enemy dares to attack from the sea, disaster awaits them." Saddam Hussein devised plans to turn the Persian Gulf into a trap for the massive and slow-moving United States ships. Iraqi propaganda loudly asserted, "For every naval target, there will be a missile. Every wave carries a mine, and every headland conceals an artillery battery." Soviet anti-ship missiles, acquired in the 1970s, were considered the main ace. These powerful missiles, designed for launch from coastal installations, were intended to strike even the most heavily protected enemy ships. Iraqi command plans envisioned several such salvos destroying an aircraft carrier or battleship, reducing it to a smoking hulk. However, no one at headquarters considered that they would be facing not individual ships, but entire strike groups, where each target was securely protected by destroyers with anti-missile defense systems, radar domes, and air cover. The second key element of defense was minefields. Along the coast of Kuwait and southern Iraq, tens of thousands of mines of various types were secretly laid, from old contact mines of World War II to more modern seabed charges. The plan was for these to be the main obstacle to the landing of Allied troops. In Saddam Hussein's mind, these minefields were supposed to deter even the most determined attempts at a breakthrough. A special role was assigned to a fleet of fast patrol boats. These small, agile vessels were to conduct sudden night attacks, unleashing missiles and artillery on the enemy, then disappearing into coastal lagoons. Generals assured that these boats could replicate the successes of the Iranians during the 1980s tanker war. For the Iraqi leadership, this was the image of modern naval guerrilla warfare, where small vessels could inflict painful bites on massive American monsters. Classic artillery was not forgotten either. Gun batteries were positioned along the entire coast, carefully camouflaged in the sand and reinforced concrete bunkers. These positions were to fire upon landing Marines and any ships daring to approach the shore. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi soldiers awaited their moment in fortified areas, convinced that an American amphibious army would pour in from the sea at any moment. Saddam himself fueled this confidence. In meetings, he declared that America was accustomed to easy victories, but this time, a battle awaited them that they would bitterly regret. He convinced officers that even if the enemy was stronger in the air, on water, and on land, a quagmire of war awaited them, where Iraqi soldiers would demonstrate true endurance. In his imagination, the U.S. fleet would get bogged down in minefields, lose several large ships to missile strikes, and then retreat under artillery barges. But reality was different. The Americans were well aware of all these preparations. Their intelligence had pinpointed battery locations. Minesweepers were developing clearing strategies, and Aegis-equipped destroyers were practicing missile interception. Every move Baghdad anticipated had already been foreseen and turned into a vulnerability. By January 1991, the Iraqi army lived in the illusion of an imminent victory. Soldiers trained to repel landings. Officers sketched counterattack plans, and Saddam prepared for a great naval battle that he believed would go down in history. He did not know that instead of the long-awaited clash, a devastating, one-sided strike awaited him, one that would obliterate all his plans within a matter of hours. The night of January 16th to 17th, 1991, would forever be remembered as the moment Iraq's expectations crumbled. While Baghdad prepared to repel an amphibious assault and for the first historically equal naval battle with America, the silence of the Persian Gulf was shattered by the fierce howl of turbines and the blinding light of cruise missiles. The battleship USS Missouri was the first to unleash its Tomahawk from the dark night, with a roar heard even in coastal areas. Dozens more launches followed, and soon hundreds of deadly projectiles were streaking through the air. Each Tomahawk flew at its own altitude, contouring the terrain, evading radar, and precisely striking chosen targets, command posts, ammunition depots, and missile complex positions. Where officers had been giving orders just an hour before, gaping craters now appeared, and telephones and radios fell silent. Hundreds of kilometers of defensive lines were paralyzed in minutes. The battleship USS Wisconsin took on the role of coordinating the missile salvos, issuing commands that directed the deadly stream to targets deep within enemy territory. The Americans turned night into a fiery spectacle. There was no artillery duel, no sortie of patrol boats, no shelling from the shore. The Iraqis simply didn't even have time to raise their weapons. For the soldiers on the coast, it was a shock. They had expected ship silhouettes, close-quarters combat, a chance to fire on landing craft. Instead, missiles rained from the sky, while nearby fuel depots ignited and bunkers exploded. In the very first hours of the war, the Iraqi defense lost command and control, and this marked the beginning of the end. The most symbolic moment was when American Pioneer drones, launched from the USS Wisconsin, hovered over Iraqi positions. For them, it was a living nightmare. They understood that every movement was being tracked, every target could be destroyed in seconds. This is how Operation Desert Storm began. It did not bring the equal naval battle promised by Iraqi propaganda. Instead, the world saw even Saddam's most formidable plans crumble before the precision and might of the American Armada. The Iraqis were not going to surrender without a fight. In the early days of the operation, Saddam Hussein ordered a retaliatory strike against the coalition fleet. The main weapon was Chinese-made Silkworm anti-ship missiles, deployed along the Kuwaiti coast. The command's intention was for these missiles to show the world that American giants were vulnerable. And so, on the evening of January 23rd, as the USS Missouri intensively shelled Iraqi fortifications on the coast, Iraqi crews launched a missile. The massive missile, leaving a long fiery trail, streaked towards the sea horizon. It was spotted almost immediately. Allied radar and patrol duties recorded everything. The Americans prepared for interception, but before the missile reached its target, it was destroyed by the British destroyer HMS Gloucester, which launched its own Sea Dart anti-missile. A few minutes later, the Iraqis launched a second, but it veered off course and fell into the sea. Thus ended the first attempt at a naval duel. Attempts to use patrol boats proved equally tragicomic. Several Iraqi fast attack craft, leaving their hidden positions under the cover of night, attempted to attack the American Armada but were detected even before reaching their attack range. Carrier-borne aircraft from aircraft carriers intercepted them from the air, and then Allied missile boats struck the surviving targets. As a result of this swift engagement, Almost all the vessels were destroyed in a matter of minutes, without even managing to launch a single missile. Coastal artillery also attempted resistance. When the battleships USS Wisconsin and USS Missouri approached to shell fortifications, individual batteries opened fire, but their accuracy was extremely low. The American battleships responded with salvos from their 16-inch guns, and each hit turned a fortification into blazing ruins. Within a few hours, many positions fell silent forever. Thus, the entire Iraqi counterattack proved to be an illusion. Missiles were shot down or fell into the water. Patrol boats did not survive to fire their first salvo. Coastal batteries were blown to pieces. In those days, it became absolutely clear there would be no equal battle. This was a clash of two eras, outdated notions of war versus modern technology, where a single salvo could decide the outcome of the entire engagement. After the failure of Iraq's attempts to counterattack, American battleships completely seized the initiative. They became symbols not only of military might, but also of the psychological pressure the coalition brought to bear on the Iraqi army. Their salvos were not merely fire support. They were the deafening thunder of war, audible for tens of kilometers, turning night into day and instilling in the enemy a deep sense of doom. The USS Missouri was the first to begin massive bombardments of coastal fortifications. Its 16-inch guns, each larger than a small car, spat out shells weighing almost a ton. These steel monsters pierced concrete bunkers, crushed fortified positions, leaving craters in the earth large enough to hide a small house. Within hours, the battleship fired over 100 shells, obliterating positions that had recently been considered impregnable. When the Missouri withdrew, the Wisconsin took its place. But this time, the Americans employed a new weapon, Pioneer drones. These small aircraft, controlled from the battleship, were used for the first time to direct fire. They hovered over Iraqi positions, transmitting precise coordinates. And enemy soldiers, seeing the strange apparatus in the sky, understood giant guns were about to strike them. This knowledge broke morale faster than the shells themselves. And indeed, an incident soon occurred that made history. Iraqi soldiers, spotting the drone and hearing the Wisconsin's first salvos, raised white flags, surrendering even before artillery struck them. Shelling was directed not only at coastal fortifications, but also at enemy communications. Supply lines, warehouses, and logistics bases, everything was destroyed with precise strikes. Particularly devastating was the strike on a large command post, which housed several Iraqi army headquarters. After the Wisconsin salvo, only a smoking desert remained where the fortified center had been, and troop command and control in the sector completely collapsed. These actions had a dual effect. From a military perspective, the Iraqi army was deprived of protection and supplies. But even more important was the psychological impact. Soldiers who had expected an equal naval battle found themselves as hunted victims, struck from afar, unable to retaliate. With each passing day, faith in a strong defense dwindled, and deserters and surrenders became more common among Iraqi units. The battleships, which seemed like museum pieces, in reality became the main stars of the war. Their salvos brought not only destruction, but also a clear signal. America had shown that even old weapons, equipped with new technology, could become an absolute weapon in modern combat. While the battleships unleashed a barrage of fire on Iraqi positions, the coalition command prepared another strike, less an artillery one than a psychological one. This involved a large-scale deception operation, in which a massive fleet was to play the role of bait. The Americans perfectly understood that Saddam Hussein and his generals would, until the very last moment, expect the main threat to come from the sea. And it was on this belief that the Allies decided to capitalize. Amphibious assault ships, with marine equipment visible on their decks, lined up off the coasts of Kuwait and southern Iraq. From the air, it looked like preparations for a large-scale landing. Radio communications, intercepted by Iraqi intelligence, were deliberately filled with casual mentions of landing points, operation start times, and assault objectives. On the ground, this caused alarm. Commanders reported to Baghdad that the Americans would attempt to invade Kuwait from the sea within hours. Under the cover of these maneuvers, the Missouri and Wisconsin continued their bombardments. They unleashed hundreds of shells on the coast, reinforcing the impression that this was an artillery barrage before a landing. In response, the Iraqis moved significant forces to the coast, transferring even units that could have bolstered defenses inland. Thus, thousands of soldiers and dozens of tanks found themselves trapped along the coast, where they never faced a real attack. A special part of this operation was a night bombardment, where the battleships fired for several hours at pre-selected empty positions. Shells tore through the sand, explosions raised columns of fire and smoke, and coalition intelligence recorded everything. Iraqi units rushed to occupy false fortifications, believing that Marines were about to land there. In reality, it was merely a spectacle, with heavy guns and drones as the main actors, transmitting the scene to Allied headquarters. This grand deception worked perfectly. For several weeks, Iraqi command kept significant forces at the coast, not daring to redeploy them inland. When the real coalition offensive began from land, it turned out that key sectors were largely left without adequate support. The American Army and its allies quickly broke through the defenses, while units remained on the coast, still awaiting a non-existent sea landing. It was these false maneuvers that ultimately deprived the Iraqis of any chance of resistance. Saddam expected a great battle on the water, but instead found himself deceived and disoriented. The United States fleet played the role not only of a hammer, but also of a smokescreen that completely shattered the enemy's strategic plans. February 1991 became the time of final collapse for all of Iraq's hopes. By this point, the coalition already had complete control of the airspace, and a rapid ground offensive was being prepared. But before ground forces moved forward, the fleet played its final chord. The USS Missouri once again approached the Kuwaiti coast and unleashed over 130 shells on fortifications. These strikes targeted bunkers, artillery positions, and coastal strongholds where troops still remained, awaiting the mythical sea landing. Soon, the Wisconsin joined the line and continued the bombardment. Their salvos tore into the earth so powerfully that observers in Saudi Arabia saw flashes on the horizon, and the sounds of the cannonade echoed for tens of kilometers. The Iraqis tried to respond, but their batteries had long since been depleted. The remnants of equipment were hidden under layers of sand and camouflage netting, but Pioneer drones easily found targets. With each new salvo, the American battleships turned positions into ruins. Resistance gradually faded, and eventually, many soldiers simply abandoned their weapons and surrendered. The episode near the city of Khafji was particularly telling. Here, Iraqi units tried to hold a bridgehead, but strikes from sea and air made it a meaningless endeavor. The battleship's artillery destroyed a battery that was still attempting to fire, and then aviation finished off the remaining armored vehicles. In the end, Iraqi forces fled, leaving behind charred tanks and shattered fortifications. The climax came on the night of February 23rd, when the coalition conducted a massive coastal bombardment. The Missouri and Wisconsin fired hundreds of shells, creating the illusion of preparation for a decisive landing. The Iraqis, anticipating this moment, never saw the Marines arrive. At the very same time, the main coalition forces were already beginning their ground offensive deeper into Kuwait, bypassing weakened and disoriented units. A few days later, Iraq's defense effectively collapsed. American and Allied forces entered Kuwait, encountering only scattered pockets of resistance, and the fleet completed its mission in a symbolic way. The Wisconsin fired the last battleship salvo in history at enemy positions, marking the end of an era for these giants. All illusions of an equal naval engagement vanished. Instead of a heroic defense and victory over American monsters, Saddam's suffer rout, and the entire world was convinced that battleships, even decades after World War II, were capable of deciding the outcome of modern conflicts. By the morning of February 28, 1991, the war was effectively over, President George Bush announced a cessation of hostilities, and the world learned that Operation Desert Storm had concluded with a swift coalition victory. Iraqi troops had been driven out of Kuwait. The army lost thousands of pieces of equipment, and its navy and coastal defenses practically ceased to exist. But it was especially symbolic that the main heroes of this campaign were not only stealth aircraft and precision-guided missiles, but also two steel titans of the last century, the battleships USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin. They fired the last naval artillery salvo of such a scale in history. The Iraqi troops, who at the start of the war had expected an equal fight with these giants, never got a single chance to get within dangerous range. All of Saddam's plans proved to be mere illusions, shattered by fire and steel. After the war, the battleships returned to the United States. They were no longer needed in a world dominated by aircraft carriers and missiles, but they retired gracefully, proving that even decades later, they could still decide the fate of battles. The Wisconsin and Missouri were soon decommissioned and then turned into museums, where thousands of people today can still walk their decks and touch living history. Iraq, on the other hand, forever lost the myth of its equal strength. All its propaganda collapsed along with its defenses, and the army, once considered one of the strongest in the region, was routed in a matter of weeks. The world clearly saw the expectations and realities of war could be vastly different. Thus concluded the final page in the history of battleships in combat. These steel giants marked the end of an era, proving that even in the late 20th century, they remained a symbol of strength and power at sea. And the story of how Iraq dreamed of an equal naval battle, but faced reality, remains a timeless lesson for all who overestimate their power and underestimate the force of technology.